Blessings, beloveds. Welcome back, Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer. Going to share some thoughts about Mercury retrograde. So this is today's chart, 31st of May, cast for Melbourne, Australia. Mercury went retrograde just a few hours ago, actually. So there's Mercury up there. Let me just get some assistance here. Okay, so there's Mercury conjunct Venus. They were together just yesterday and the day before. Venus is now moving faster, which is not the usual way. It is usually Mercury that moves faster than Venus, but because Mercury is retrograde, it was stationary for the last couple of days. So stationary means like it's literally just stopped in its tracks. And of course, Venus is moving away from Mercury. That little signature there for a couple of days was a nice energy relative to stimulating the poet. Music, lyrics, writing, things like that, inspired through Venus, of course, and Mercury is the expression of that in the written or spoken word. I think this Mercury cycle is going to probably cause quite a bit of havoc, to be honest. And I've alluded to this, with a few posts here and there on Instagram or community section here on the YouTube channel. And the main reason for that, of course, is because there is a square to Neptune. Okay, so here's Neptune at 23 degrees of Pisces. Let me just erase that. Clear. And just grab something else. Okay, so there's Neptune in Pisces. And as I said, there's Mercury retrograde in Gemini. And the distance between them forms a square. I can't draw a square with this. Okay, disregard that. So imagine that the distance between transiting Mercury in the heavens at the moment and transiting Neptune in the heavens basically form what's called a square relationship to each other. So it's mutable signs. Gemini is a mutable sign, and Pisces is a mutable sign. I've got a bit of a sinus head cold, so if it interferes with my faster level of communicating, then I apologize, but it's just how my headspace is placed at the moment. But I have been reflecting on these energies the last couple of days quite a lot, because it's actually brought up some things in my own personal life. And I guess the first place to start, before we even start considering the square, the first thing I want to highlight is that last year Mercury was retrograde in the water signs, so in Cancer, Scorpio and Pisces. And without question, that was the absolute utter confusion and very strong emotional attachment to things as well, relative to the year of 2020 and what came into this nature of reality, which it has proven to be extremely chaotic, right, on every spectrum for all of us in different ways. Doesn't matter where we are located, doesn't matter who we are. We've all been subjected to this 2020 breakout, right, which is still continuing. And it's quite fascinating that Mercury goes retrograde in the air signs this year. So it went retrograde earlier this year in Aquarius back in January. And I guess the sequence that I'm noticing is that earlier this year when Mercury was in Aquarius, it was forming a square to to Uranus in Taurus. Okay, so imagine Mercury was in Aquarius, so down here, and the distance between Aquarius to Taurus creates what's called a square. Okay, it's 90 degrees. So anyway, we've been through that, but the point is that there was a hard aspect by one of the transpersonal planets, in this case being Uranus. And then currently, being the end of May, and we're ready just to step into the 1st of June tomorrow, transiting Mercury is forming a square to another transpersonal planet, in this case Neptune. This is the trickiest one out of all, and we'll unpack that in a moment. And then later this year, when Mercury enters Libra, which will be September the 20... that's not when it enters Libra, but the retrograde period of Mercury in Libra begins on the 27th of September right through to 23rd of October. So Mercury is always retrograde for about 3 weeks or so. Okay, so we've got 3 retrograde periods, which is normal. That's what happens every year with Mercury. This year it happens to be in all the air signs. So let's just make a few comments about that. The air quality, which corresponds to many, many things, but obviously the most obvious thing it corresponds to is the air we breathe, and speech, communication. So there's still an extreme level of uncertainty and confusion about this collective health matter. And there is still a lot of misinformation, misguided information, accusations, allegations, half-truths, manipulated information. It just goes on and on and on and on. And every week virtually we have something, a new idea coming in, presented through some body or government, and the only thing it seems to do is create a further sense of uncertainty and insecurity, because there seems to be no end in sight. So that's going to be the theme really again this year, unfortunately. The other thing, of course, that is really, really adding to that is, have I got her in here? No, I haven't got her. So anyway, Eris, the goddess Eris, E-R-I-S, who's at late degrees of Aries, we know has been forming a square to Pluto, right, the last couple of years. So the whole time since this pandemic started, we've had this Eris squaring Pluto, and that's a huge implication and indicator towards this collective reality as we see it, and as we've been seeing it, certainly for the last 18 months. So that's still in play, right? Even though Eris has moved on a little bit from Pluto, being exactly square. But what we need to consider, in my observations, when you are looking at Pluto's transit, because it's the slowest moving planetary body, it takes 248 years to do a lap around the chart, for instance. And when I see transits from Pluto to, let's just say, our own natal chart, whether it's to a planet or to an angle of the chart or to a node or whatever it may be, whilst there is a technical date as to when the exact aspect begins, it is without any doubt whatsoever, through my observations, that the energy of the Pluto transit really starts to take effect at least 6 months before the exact date. That's been my 100% observation and correlation in people's charts that I've worked with and in my own life. So I have no doubt about that, and there's lots of evidence I could bring to the table for that. So the point I'm trying to make is that with Eris, who has an orbit of something ridiculous, like, I just can't quite remember, I think it's 800 years or something crazy like that. A really, really incredibly slow moving body. I'd imagine that the fact that she moves so slowly, perhaps the aspect that she's making to Pluto, even though she's moving away from Pluto, the orb of that aspect is probably in play for a lot longer than we would normally consider, right? And I'm saying that because of just how slowly she actually moves. It seems to be that the slower something moves, obviously the longer it lasts, right? So there's something about that seems to play out in the field of orbs as well, which is just showing us the build up, of an energy, and then the waning or the decreasing, of that energy as it starts to separate. So an applying aspect and a separating aspect. And so applying and separating aspects are a very important component in understanding astrology and any two bodies that we are looking at that are having an aspect together. And when it comes to slower moving bodies, I would say that the orb, the energy is in play longer than we might think. And so I'm suggesting that this Pluto square Eris is in play for, most certainly this year and quite possibly next year as well. So that to me kind of describes the catastrophic, cataclysmic world of events, reality, and the no end in sight, because Eris is the goddess of destruction, and so is Pluto for that matter, god of destruction as well, right? So there's this incredibly intense process of destruction and decay that's going on, that when we try to process that reality from a linear left brain, it just brings up anxiety, fear, uncertainty, and we don't really have a lot of answers, right? Because perhaps a lot of this is still very unknown, even from higher sort of sources or authorities, or perhaps it's not. We still don't even know that. But whatever it is, at the everyday kind of level, for most of us, there is great uncertainty. And again, there's no end in sight at the moment. And so in between, we have all these other cycles going on as well. So going back to Mercury is having 3 retrograde cycles this year. As I said, it already went through one in Aquarius. Now it's going through the next one in Gemini, which will be forming the square to Neptune. And then later this year, when Mercury enters Libra, it's actually going to form a square to Pluto, right? This is when Mercury will be in Libra, okay, which will be over here. So the theme that I'm seeing here is that the air element, as I said, is connected to breathing, and this particular situation that's going on collectively is connected to the part of our body that breathes, right? Our lungs and so forth. So that's one thing that's very interesting to me. And being squared off by these outer planets, Mercury, that is, and Mercury, of course, corresponds to the lungs as well. So Mercury is being hit off in hard aspects by the 3 transpersonal planets while it's retrograde. And that has, its extremely challenging levels to it, but it also has some beneficial components too. The challenging components are that the truth of the matter is, when it comes to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, as much as we may understand those archetypes intellectually through the readings we've done or videos we watch or whatever it is, the truth is that most people are really not operating from a Uranus, Neptune, Pluto type of level. It's not an easy thing to do. It's just not as simple as one might think. It's not like you read a book on Uranus, so now you've integrated Uranus because you've read a book on Uranus. It's actually it's actually more about the life choices and the level of consciousness that one integrates that will possibly start, connecting with and speaking to, being more integrated with those energies. Those energies they're not called transpersonal for no reason. Transpersonal takes us away from what? From the personal. And on the everyday level, in our ordinary normal functioning, we are operating at the personal level. That's just the nature of human beings. So we need to kind of consider that, I suppose, when we're looking at, those outer planets, those transpersonal planets. And it's not about reading about Pluto or reading about Uranus and suddenly thinking that you're totally integrated with those energies. That's just a left brain linear opinion or perspective or idea. That's all that is. Integration is a part of consciousness, right? It's a part of evolution, of course, consciousness. And it's largely an experience that happens within. It's got nothing to do with what you are seeing out there or what's going on out there. It's got to do with what you're seeing out there from the point of view of how much one might be projecting out there and how much one just has the ability to observe the nature of reality, but have a really good understanding and inner knowing of themselves and their own level of consciousness and truth therein as well. I'm speaking about all this because Mercury retrograde, according to Jeffrey Wolf Green especially, he says that Mercury retrograde it's a little bit similar like a Jupiter archetype. And the reason for that is because generally when Mercury is moving in his direct motion, it's that body, the messenger. He's the god of the messengers. It's that part of our left brain that learns and connects all the dots and seeks for information and facts and details and things like that. It's just your everyday communication with your family, your loved ones, your friends, whomever. It's that everyday, mental process where there's it's not a reflective process. It's more of just a natural process of thought communication where it just kind of happens sort of naturally, for better or for worse sometimes. So it's the left brain. The right brain, which is Sagittarius, Jupiter, has that level associated to it because the right brain corresponds to our intuition and the left brain, Mercury, corresponds to thought, thinking, data, and so forth. So when Mercury is retrograde, the natural sort of function of Mercury is to be expressed externally, right? It's an external sort of force when Mercury is operating just at its normal level, moving direct in motion. When it goes retrograde, it takes an inner process and journey towards all the content of all the thought, learning, ideas, and so forth that's been accumulated over some time. And I suppose we can just say, well, what have we been processing, learning, developing, communicating, absorbing, connecting with relative to Mercury things, since earlier this year, right? We can look at it like that. And so now here we've arrived virtually in the beginning of June. Mercury is going retrograde in the sign of Gemini, and we now have to turn within and really actually start to filter and process all the stuff that we have absorbed on that mental level. And it's a bit like a clearing out. We're clearing out perhaps and discarding, you could say, information or ideas or data or thought processes or whatever it is that actually is no longer needed, or in fact is not really contributing to your evolution moving forward, let's say. But we're always absorbing data and information, most of which is happening subconsciously and unconsciously as well. So there's that level too. But when Mercury is retrograde, it is a time for us to take a step back, to reflect, to not be so impulsive, let's say, and to really kind of mentally reevaluate our whole learning processes. The square to Neptune, and the fact that Mercury retrograde is more a Jupiter sort of flavor, it's actually pointing to that the retrograde period is where we tune into our intuition to actually find a way of connecting with the information or data or thoughts or learning material from that intuitive faculty in order to integrate it further, and so that we can discard what is just an accumulation of ideas or thoughts that actually really don't serve much of a purpose other than just making your brain space incredibly preoccupied and busy and unable to rest and relax and give time and energy to a space where you might reflect and not necessarily go into that space where the mind just jumps around from this idea to that idea to this idea to that idea. And in Gemini, that's what it wants to do. It's so stimulated, Mercury in Gemini, incredibly stimulated for communication, more learning, more knowledge, and it can be very scattered, right? And mutability, which is Gemini, it's a mutable sign. Mutability has that component to it where it, whilst it may be able to fuse in and out of different levels of thinking or experiences, it's very fluid in nature. It really lacks the ability to stay focused at one particular thing. It tends to get very scattered. Now, the square to Neptune, which really is actually, let me just animate the chart. So I'll just pop that into days. So there's Mercury at 24, a retrograde, and if we just go ahead one day at a time, and you'll see the date's just going to change up here on the left-hand side, and everything is going to move according to the speed of its movement on a daily basis. Everything moves at a different speed, right? Every single thing in the chart has a different speed of movement per day. So one day forward, 1st of June, let me just remove that, those lines. So there's Mercury at 24, as I said. 1st of June. Let's proceed to go forward. It's still at 24 because it's moving incredibly slowly. It's retrograde, right? So you can see that Venus is, she's like racing off now. She's getting ready to move into Cancer. Okay, Neptune's at 23. Neptune moves very slowly. So basically, what I'm getting at is that for the more or less the whole month of June, this Mercury Neptune square is going to be active, right? Through Mercury's retrograde cycle. Even though Mercury, I'm just moving a bit faster now. So 16th of June, you can see Mercury's gone down to about 18 degrees. Now 18 degrees is not very far from 23, so that that square is still there. And it's even going to go, where is it? Okay, so this is where it stops again. It's stationary. Mercury is stationary here on the 22nd of June. And so now it's slow down again, stopping, because it's going to change its movement in the opposite direction. It's going to start going direct. But you can see that it went retrograde right back to about 16 degrees, which is about 7 degrees away from Neptune, okay? But this square is still in play. So as we proceed forward, you can see now Mercury is just moving direct. And as a matter of fact, we can say that the square to Neptune is really in play until the 6th of July. So, that's about 5 weeks' time. We have a Mercury square Neptune for a 5-week period. That's not typical. And the only reason that's happening is because Mercury is going retrograde in that sign at the degrees that it is, which keeps it within close enough proximity to being in a square relationship to Neptune. Now, on a spiritual level, the Mercury-Neptune is a very advantageous time for spiritual downloads, spiritual insights, spiritual work, whether that's creative writing as well, or journaling, in your diary, meditation, painting, poetry, music, a number of different practices and processes that would enable you to connect more deeply to your spiritual self or spiritual life is where this energy could really excel, where you could really get a lot out of this. But even with that, you'd have to, I suppose, make sure that you be as objective as you possibly can be, because Mercury Neptune is can be seeing what you want to see, hearing what you want to hear, listening to what you want to listen to. And that can be blocking out certain truths or certain realities, or certain bits of information that you don't want to hear, that you don't like, that you're not ready to hear, whatever it may be. Or it can be manipulating words or the truth yourself as well, or just being utterly and totally confused about what the truth is. So there's various levels as to how this can play out. And at the highest level, as I said, when we employ this in our spiritual world and life, there is much gain that can be accomplish through this, and it's not, we're not talking about ego gain, personality gain. We're talking about a gain that would be nurturing and fostering to your spiritual development through specific practices that you might really focus on during this time. The other level is, as I said, my favorite saying that Rob Hand has, which is manipulating the airways at the other person's expense. So basically what he's saying there is that, Mercury, Neptune, hard aspects specifically, can create conversations or exchanges between two people or more, whoever it may be. It could be like a government between another government or whatever. It depends, whether we're looking at that collectively or personally or professionally or whichever way. Mercury, Neptune has that level to it where the information can be consciously and purposely manipulated, in other words, lying, or it can be that, like I said before, you're not seeing the truth of what's being presented. Neptune corresponds to not being able to see clearly, as it were. It's what corresponds to a mist or a fog, fantasy, ideals, illusion, disillusionment, and ultimately disappointment when we're not being realistic with what's being presented. The point is, though, that a Mercury square Neptune makes it incredibly difficult to be totally objective, 100% clear on what's being presented. So I guess one of the better ways to handle this transit is, first of all, when it comes to signing and agreeing to any type of legal binding sort of contract, in my opinion, I would be very, extremely cautious about what you're actually committing to. So you'd want to get that checked out, by a couple of different sources, a couple of different people. If you bullshit somebody around about this time, it will just end up, you'll come undone. It will show eventually. The other level is that there can just be terrible confusion between communications at the moment in general. And I suppose the best way to handle that is to try and be as direct as you can be, and not assume things, right? Because assumptions under this type of transit can create all sorts of distortions. And those distortions can become this narrative and story in your mind that are not really founded in truth, but it's just what you are perceiving. So this is a very, 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 very tricky transit, okay? A very tricky transit, and it's really coloring, the whole month of June and the first week of July. And so we really need to be paying attention to this. It can be so sort of misleading and misguiding in ways that we can get so fooled, so easily fooled and blindsided by things that we normally would be, so clear about, right? And think that we might be on top of things, because, I'm a really good communicator, or I'm a really good listener, or I read things very carefully. You may be all those things, but under a Mercury Neptune, it's like a spell. It can be like a spell that creates this other sort of narrative or level of reality that in many cases may not be rooted in any actual facts or truth. So just something to be very, very careful of. But as I said, spiritually, this is like, this is a great time working on your own spiritual nourishment and meditation practices, inner sort of processes and dialogues. And Mercury retrograde is saying it's time to slow down. Time to slow down and check out what have you been accumulating, for the last 5 months. What information have you been accumulating and absorbing and just kind of piling it on in your head, in your mind? That could be through studying you've been doing, reading, communications, chats, whatever. So it's time to sort through that now and actually get some intuitive perspective on it all, rather than it just being this package of all this data that's just sitting there, piled on, but you don't know what to do with it because it's just information. But what does it actually mean? How is this useful to me to know all this? How can I use this in my life? How can I use it to have a better understanding of what I've learned or what I'm learning? This is what Mercury retrograde gives us an opportunity to do, to check all that stuff out and sort through it and go into, deeper layers of our intuition. I can't highlight it enough. The Mercury square Neptune's going to be an incredibly challenging time. And I think on the collective scale level, it's going to be pretty chaotic, actually, from the level of, again, what's being communicated to us about what's happening in the world regarding this global situation, the health global situation. We just, here in Australia, we just went into lockdown last week again. Just happened just like that, randomly. We just had some new cases. Well, in Melbourne, actually, I shouldn't say all of Australia, although everyone else in Australia, every state has sort of closed off its borders to the other state, and so yeah, each state is sort of sticking to themselves, as it were. But I currently am staying in Melbourne, and Melbourne went into full lockdown mode as of last week because we had some new transmissions in the community. Very interesting. The day that the announcement was made for the lockdown was when Saturn was exactly at the same degree it was just before it went retrograde. So Saturn was at, what was it? I don't know, 13 degrees and some minutes, something like that, right? And then about a day or 2 days later, it stops and then it goes retrograde. And just that time, that's when we get that announcement. Now, that's significant to us because Australia is a very Saturnian country. There's no two ways about that. That's not a personal opinion. That's if you know Australia, if you're from here and you understand astrology, you'd have no problem understanding that. It's the declaration of the date of Australia's national chart. The sun was in Capricorn. It's a Saturn country. So when significant things like that happen here in Australia or in Melbourne, Saturn's doing something very important in its movement in the heavens, as it was on that day. It's like it was just literally at the same sort of minute and degree as it was just before it went retrograde. So that was an interesting correlation. And so even for us here, relative to what I was trying to explain a minute ago about the confusion, Mercury square Neptune, just to give you an example, up to about a week ago, the advice here was given that if you're under 50, you're not. It is best that you don't take the vaccine if you're under 50, because the vaccines that they have here have connected to situations where people have experienced severe blood clots, and there's even been deaths. That's just a fact. So there's just been inconsistent advice given about all that pretty much from day one anyway, but it's still continuing. That's my point. And so a week ago, not even a week ago, I think it was just around about the time when they said you're all going back into lockdown. Then they said, well, actually now if you are under 50, you can now go and get the vaccine. And they didn't give a reason for that. They didn't say, well, you know, we are confident. We are confident through research and study and observation that this will be safe. That this is the way to go. And no, they just said, well, so now we've decided that if you're under 50, you can take it. And so anyway, the point being that there's just really really confusing messages, which I think is going to be blown out of proportion even more with this Mercury retrograde in a really crazy way. And that will be a collective thing, because Mercury retrograde squaring transiting Neptune in Pisces is a collective transit, and each of us, depending on our location, collectively will experience it according to the events and nature of reality, depending on where you are and what's happening, relative to organizations, systems, etc., etc. But is it going to be chaotic? Yeah, I have no doubt whatsoever. And I guess perhaps the takeaway about that would be to just kind of, if you can just be, objective, detached, and aware that this energy, is manipulating the airwaves, which could give information that's not necessarily accurate or truthful, which could lead to making decisions or or believing in something that may not necessarily be 100% factual, right? So I think it's just going to be really important to be very aware and observant of that. And so any really sort of life altering kind of decisions, in my personal opinion, would be best to be held off at a time like this. It's just it would just be the wiser thing to do. And Mercury retrograde, as I said before, is where we can access the Jupiter sort of level of it, which is tuning into our intuition. The Neptune can act as a way of tuning more deeply into our intuition, but that would be, I think, that would be more in processes and experiences where you are working spiritually. It's not something that you're going to see out there in the world. What we're likely to see out there in the world is just the nature of how confusing and conflicting and dividing all the different messages are, and just how different they are from one place to the next, or from one person to the next. And at the same time, while this is happening, we have transiting Mars forming an opposition to Pluto. And that's a pretty explosive energy. Mars is in its fall, so it's not very happy in its fall. That's a very emotional Mars, and it can be emotional displacement, angry emotional displacement, because it's opposite Pluto, and Pluto's really sort of facing off with it, if you like. It's activating it. This can be a really intense period of feeling really intense feelings about something that maybe you've been bottling up, not being open about it, not being direct about it. And so as Pluto and Mars close in on their exact opposition. So it's already in play here today, for instance. And let's just go forward. It becomes exact around here, around the 5th of June. So for the next 5 or 6 days, this energy is activated. Very intense energy that's activated, and collectively, that's a real that can speak to pretty dangerous events transpiring. Now, I read on the news yesterday that there was another shooting in Miami, in the USA. I think at the time when I was reading it, there were 2 people had been killed and 20 people had been injured by a shotguns. So anyway, that's a Mars-Pluto. That's a Mars-Pluto event. It's guns. Mars rules guns. Mars and Pluto in manifesting on that level, which is the everyday personal level, is an explosion of anger and violence and conflict. There was another shooting not so long ago. Again, I know in America this seems to, it seems to happen frequently. I'm aware of that, but I'm just highlighting that it is these sorts of energies that seem to show up when those sorts of events take place in the world. So, moving forward, as I said, Mercury later in the year, and we'll come back and talk about this later in the year because it's not until September, but Mercury in Libra will actually be squaring Pluto. That's going to be another very important retrograde cycle, but through the lens of Pluto. I won't talk about that today, but I just wanted to highlight that so that we can have some reflection around that in terms of what the rest of the year looks like with Mercury's journey in the air signs, which is our breathing and our whole mental faculties and the information we are receiving, absorbing, and giving out, and just the challenges around that, particularly with Mercury Neptune. And of course, we have the Uranus Saturn square, which is kicked off in the month of June again. We had one earlier this year, so that's going to amp things up again relative to the establishment, Saturn, and the part of humanity that needs to feel a sense of liberation and more power in their sovereignty and freedom. It's always, the establishment against the non-establishment. So that cycle is breaking a lot of things down, and by breaking things down, it's got to bring things into crisis. That's what square aspects do. They bring things into crisis, critical events, cataclysmic events, but only just to perhaps dismantle what needs to be dismantled. And Uranus and Saturn couldn't be more opposed to each other in terms of what they represent. So those two squaring each other off, that there's going to be things that happen in pretty big ways collectively. I'll talk about that more in depth another day because I'm actually just, like I said, kind of battling with a sinus kind of head cold type of thing. Just finally, before I go, I want to just acknowledge a lady by the name of Linda Johnson. Some of you may or may not know of her. I don't know her personally, but I do know her through the evolutionary astrological community, interacting through that community over the past 3 years specifically. I had some interactions with her on that level as a community exchange. Anyway, unfortunately she passed away just yesterday or the day before. My mind just feels like a big Neptune fog at the moment because of this head cold I've got. So Mercury square Neptune is hitting me pretty hard on that level, and I've just been resting for the last 48 hours because I've just had to. So hearing that news, I was shocked, even though I had seen something that I'd seen a post by Linda not very long ago. It was just a month ago, where she'd announced that she was stepping down from doing any more evolutionary astrology Zoom classes indefinitely, and just instinctively I could feel that something quite serious was going on. So anyway, 2 days ago it was announced that she passed away. So I would just like to express my deepest condolences and wishes to her family and friends. I didn't know her personally, but she seemed to be a really lovely lady and soul, and very dedicated to the astrological community, and she wasn't very old either. So it's always sad to me when someone leaves the world. It doesn't matter what age they are. It's always something deeply, deeply sad about that, even though the soul really is just continuing on its journey. So we don't. The whole death birth thing is just part of this 3D reality. That's all it is. So, but when we're here on this earth plane and we're living our life through this reality, we form different connections and alliances and attachments, and that's just part of this human condition and life journey. So when there is an apparent ending, for me anyway, and I think for most people, yeah, it's sad. It's just sad to me. It's just really sad, and perhaps that sort of triggers things inside me. Having had my father, transcend this world. It was 4 years ago now, and still feels like it was yesterday. That should perhaps indicate to you just how raw it all still feels to me. So, yeah, much love to Linda on her journey moving forward. She'll be missed, I'm sure, by many, many people. And I will leave it there, and I'll see you guys very soon. There's a solar eclipse coming up, 10th of June, 10 days away. I want to come back and talk about that soon. And hopefully in the next couple of days, I just need to rest a bit more. Hoping you're all doing well. And yeah, see you guys very, very soon. Much love. Thanks for listening. Bye.